Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 14 of the Exoskeletons and Wearable Robotics podcast. Today, we are very fortunate to have a special guest, Sarah Ballini-Ross, and we will be talking about applications of occupational exoskeletons in small, medium, and large businesses. So, as always, we have our co-host, Tom Sugar from the Wearable Robotics Association, and me, Bobby Marino from the Exoskeleton Report. And we have with us Sarah Ballini-Ross with Evolving Innovation and many other businesses.
Thanks, Bobby. Joy to be on your podcast today.
So before we start, special thanks to our Patreons. We don't have any new ones, but again, this is a good time to shout out to our VIP supporters, Volker Bartenbach, Rita Vasquez-Torres, Minmar, and our corporate sponsor levels, Humutech and Oxivo. Hi, Sarah. So happy to have you here. So for those who might not know Sarah, she's a small business owner, a tech consultant for ergonomic solution, a farm, a speaker, and a specialist. So you are a really rare person who actually understands how to apply occupational exoskeletons from a large enterprise, Fortune 500 company, all the way down to a single family small business. And that is a very rare thing in the exoskeleton industry.
Yeah, I've had a lot of fun with exoskeletons over the past 5 years. I got my start with exoskeletons at a workers' compensation insurance company where we insured mostly small to medium-sized businesses. And so the idea of having a solution that can be applicable to businesses of all sizes was something that was really a passion for me, and trying to figure out how do you make something as complicated as an exoskeleton accessible to any worker, regardless of who they work for.
And I think recently you've started a company also that is going to be focusing on that. Could you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, about a year ago, Matthew Marino and I founded our own consulting company, Evolving Innovation. And we really are seeking out companies that are struggling with their ergonomic program and help bring cutting edge technology like exoskeletons, but also other things like AI and virtual reality and augmented reality to their work sites to help them digitize their safety programs and reduce injuries and help keep their workforce healthy and productive.
So you don't think of occupational exoskeletons like in a vacuum, but more like an ecosystem of emerging ergonomic solutions. Can you tell us like what some of those are?
Definitely. Well, in order for Exos to really work, you have to have an ergonomics program. Exoskeletons are hard. I'll be the first to admit they're one of the hardest solutions to go to. So you want to make sure you've kind of exhausted all the easy things on a hierarchy of controls, that you're not just jumping to exoskeletons. You've looked at the job and the tasks, and you've looked at it, are there ways that we can modify the environment to make it easier on a worker? And if you've gone through all of those things, that's where exoskeletons can kind of come in. When you don't have any other options left in your goodie bag, they're a great solution for that. But you have to go through some steps to get there. Oftentimes, what I've seen companies do is they go to a great trade show and there's amazing exoskeleton vendors and they get really excited about exoskeletons, but they haven't always done some of that foundational work. And so then when they pilot an exoskeleton, it doesn't go very well sometimes because it's hard and it's challenging. And there's a lot of steps to get before you're putting exoskeletons on the body. Oftentimes, you really have to have a true understanding of what the problem is and then figuring out what's the right solution. And that's where if you're able to engage your employees in that process, they're a lot more excited to put on an exoskeleton when it comes time for that versus you just rolling out a box of exoskeletons and telling employees that they're going to be wearing them. Because I'll be the first to admit, they're oftentimes pretty hot and uncomfortable, and sometimes they get in the way, and they're not always a joy to wear for 8 hours a day. And so it's really critical that employees have an option and a choice in that process and help have their insights help inform what the right exoskeleton or solution may be.
So would you say it's kind of like learning to ride a bicycle? It can really help you to get
Yeah.
from point A to point B, but it needs to be the right bicycle. So if we don't have a paved road, it would be nice to have a bicycle with a suspension. And then you will have to have that learning process where there will be some initial frustration and you will fall down potentially even once or twice.
Definitely. Oftentimes people ask me what my favorite exoskeleton is, and it's kind of like a pair of shoes or a bicycle. right? It really depends on what you're doing that day. If you're cruising down a mountain biking trail, you're going to want a very different bicycle if you're doing some road bicycling. And that's the same thing with exoskeletons, is it really takes looking at the job and the task and the employee to see what that right exo is going to be. There is no universal answer of what the best exoskeleton is for that. It really, there's so many different variables, but it's very familiar. Once you kind of get to know an exoskeleton, it only gets easier, but it is trying to get over that initial learning curve of understanding how does the exo help you with the tasks? What are the little tricks and tips to make it easier for you? And how can you get that assistance really when you need it the most?
I see. Just listening to you, I have so many questions to ask that we'll be here for 2 days straight. So in my mind, I'm just trying to prioritize where to even start. Maybe we should start from the beginning. Like, I hear this argument that ideally we want occupational exoskeletons to be an out-of-the-box solution, like safety glasses or a hard hat. You open it up, the employee or the final end user puts it on and it just works. And then you have technology which has been around for centuries now, like base plate respirators, where to this day it is a big no-no, at least in the United States, for you to try to fit it yourself. It is expected that there will be external help, that there will be a fit test done by an outside entity, that there will be research, that there will be an entire respiratory protection program in place first before you go and actually decide to use a personal protective respirator. So like you mentioned, you will have to go through the hierarchy of controls first and things like that. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? In your experience, what have you seen in trying to apply occupational exoskeletons without structure, training, implementation, and how does it differ from a structured implementation strategy?
Yeah, I mean, exoskeletons can work outside of the box. You just have to really adjust your expectations. You have to give people the time to play with them and explore them if you're not going to have a structured program. I think the biggest thing with exoskeletons is making sure they fit correctly. And that's where a lot of people struggle just taking it out of the box, is making sure it truly is fitting the user correctly. Because when you don't have an optimal fit, that's when a lot more of the uncomfort issues happen. That's when exoskeletons start getting in the way. People don't necessarily feel the assistance. And it's not always intuitive what the perfect fit is. And each style of exoskeleton has a few different nuances to the fit. Some need to be over the joint, some need to be on the joint, some needs to be above and below. And so really understanding how is this exoskeleton designed to fit somebody and helping somebody achieve that optimal fit, and then having them understand what does it feel like when it's fitting you correctly. That way they can build that self-sufficiency. That's the biggest thing of just taking it out of the box and expecting it to work. But then it's also that task matching. When you start talking about small and medium sized businesses, oftentimes those employees are doing so many different things throughout the day, where there may be a few tasks that the exoskeleton really helps with, but oftentimes there's a lot of tasks that the exoskeleton may not be helping with. So a lot of that kind of structure is helping to identify where are the opportunities to use the exoskeleton and when does it make sense to take it off and give your body a chance to breathe. And that's where sometimes if you just set out exoskeletons, you'll see a low adoption rate because people don't see the benefit of it. Where if you're in a manufacturing environment and you're doing the same task over and over and over again for 8 hours a day, where every single repetition is something that benefits the exoskeleton, it makes it a little bit easier to use it when you have that much usage. When people start seeing the benefits of an exoskeleton, when they start feeling it help them, that's when they get excited about using it. But when it's all the other times where it's hot and uncomfortable and not really helping them, that's what makes people not want to use an exoskeleton.
And Tom, you had a thought?
Well, follow-up was, I was just going to say, could you give us a nice example of like, here's a win? Like, I went into a company, you don't have to, name the company or the product, but I went into a company, they were doing this task. It was really beneficial. Then I told them to take it off for 2 hours and then put it back on and that kind of thing. Could you give us just kind of a real world example?
Yeah, last summer, this isn't even a business that I was working with, but I have a small farm, as Bobby mentioned, and I was building a walk-in refrigerator and freezer to store our products in when we have a big batch. And I hired a refrigeration company, and it was a small one-man business who's that's all he does is refrigeration. Well, most of the refrigeration things are done on a concrete slab. And so he's bent over pretty much the entire day working at that, or me being me. Of course, I have a closet full of exoskeletons in my house. So I went inside, grabbed an exoskeleton, gave him the 30-second version of what this was. He had never heard of it before. I always get like Terminator or Iron Man references, but I don't watch TV, so those always go way over my head. But I gave him a quick rundown of what it was and said, "Is this something you would be interested in trying?" He was pretty game for it. He was open to try it because his back hurt. He was in his 50s. He's been doing this for over 30 years, and his body is tired. And the instant he put it on and bent down, he could tell the difference. And by the end of that service appointment, he was saying things like, why aren't these exoskeletons at every refrigeration trade show? This is something that just makes sense for every industry. And he was asking me how to buy it, and he had an assistant with him that day, and he wanted his turn with it. And it really had that stickiness because he saw that immediate benefit. He already experienced what happens when you work all of those years without the assistance, and he saw that need. He was also the owner, so if he needed to take that 10 minutes to be able to play with the exoskeleton and understand how it works and be able to get the fit, that was okay because he wasn't having to justify to somebody else why he wasn't on billable hours for the entire time. And so that, I think, was a really good success story. He came out a few more times to work on things around the farm, and every time he said, "Hey, do you have one of those exoskeletons for me to try?" And I had a chance of putting him in a few different exoskeletons so he could kind of see the gamut of different styles and different ways of receiving assistance because he was very interested in going out and purchasing them on his own.
Yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful story.
And then in full transparency, I've gone out on other job sites where workers have absolutely loved it, but for one reason or another, it just didn't. One of the places I demoed exoskeletons, they used a lot of large kilns, and so they were hoping that it would help them as they're bending down into the kilns, taking tiles in and out. That would be a good way to help them protect their backs during those tasks. Well, unfortunately, those kilns were so hot already, and the other kind of protective equipment that the employees had to wear to keep them safe from those high temperatures, it just made it too much to wear the exoskeletons, where they were able to say, if we could cool down the kilns and we could wait till everything was, a comfortable 70 degrees instead of over 100 degrees, we'd probably use the exoskeletons, but it's just too hot and too uncomfortable with how hot with that many layers it was. So oftentimes, even if it is a good solution, there's other barriers that make it not always feasible to use exoskeletons.
Yeah, and we've heard now.
We've heard. I was going to say we've heard that. We've heard that if you're working in a refrigeration, it works really well. And then we've also heard on a different podcast that if it's super, super, super hot and you're sweating anyways, they say I might as well wear it because I'm already sweating. And then they said there's this middle temperature where people weren't interested in wearing the device. Anyway, some things we'd heard.
Our guest George was saying that in the future, exoskeleton should have a temperature control unit as part of the exo.
Then he had more weight.
Yeah, I've heard this. I know it's more weight, but I've thought about like just a fan, just like a battery and a fan with a passive exo or something. I don't know.
Some exoskeletons have tried that. I had a shoulder exoskeleton that had some fans you could clip on the back, and still didn't really make a huge difference, unfortunately. I think that's where the design of figuring out how can you provide the assistance with as minimal contact on the body as possible is really critical, because anytime you're just adding layers, even if they are breathable, it still just makes it pretty dang warm. I use exoskeletons a lot on my farm. That's how I gained my comfort level with exoskeletons and achieved my level of mastery with exos. And you don't have the luxury of finding that perfect temperature when you're using exoskeletons on the farm. I've put them on in anywhere from minus 20 degrees in my walk-in freezer when we're unboxing, 7 beef and trying to organize it, to doing hay when it's 105 degrees. And that's where really understanding what's it like to be in a sweaty exo for hours on end. So that way I can be really honest with employees when I'm working with them, and I'm not just trying to tell them It's going to be great. You're going to be super comfortable. I can say you're going to be really hot and sweaty. Here's how sweaty my back gets. And I have a whole album on my phone dedicated to sweaty exoskeleton pictures to just kind of show people the real world of what it's like wearing exos. But at the end of the day, would you rather have a sweaty back or a hurt back is kind of where it comes down to. And that's people's answer that people are going to have to kind of come up with for themselves. Is their thermal discomfort so great that it overweighs that physical discomfort that may last long after the task, or is it something that they're willing to put up with being a little bit warmer and a little bit sweatier in order to get that assistance? And I know for me, when I'm doing hay, it's an easy trade-off. I'd much rather be in that exoskeleton as long as it stays up and doesn't get in the way than doing hay without an exoskeleton, because I'm an office worker more hours of the day than I'm a farm worker. So anytime I have to do those hard physical farming tasks for hours and days on end, I really feel it now compared to my husband, who's a full-time farmer and using his body all day, every day in those ways. But for me, an exoskeleton really comes to shine in those moments.
Well, thank you for giving us that piece of your experience. So I'm really interested in asking you, what is your know-how, words of wisdom, what you've learned in working with small and medium businesses? Because on the Exoskeleton report and in general at the exoskeleton conferences, the vast majority of the stories that we hear is how large companies that have 9,000 and more employees trying to learn how to use occupational exoskeletons effectively. It's not every day that we get to hear what is this like from the point of view of a small or medium business.
Yeah, it's highly variable. The joys of doing exoskeletons with small and medium-sized businesses, oftentimes they're very nimble. They don't have to have a big project just to figure out where it makes sense to deploy exoskeletons. They know right off the top of their head what are those couple tasks or couple employees who would really benefit from it. There's oftentimes less layers to have to go through when it comes to the approval, but where the challenge oftentimes comes in is that price piece. Smaller and medium-sized companies rarely have a full-time safety person, let alone extra money in the safety budget to be able to purchase things like exoskeletons and to be able to make that prevention justification. Oftentimes people will say, well, it's a lot cheaper than a back injury, but typically like a small to medium-sized business, they may only have a claim once every 10 or 15 years. And so that doesn't make the same level of justification as a large company that's dealing with multiple back claims or shoulder claims within a given year. And so that's where it's a little bit harder to have that prevention mindset with a smaller company that may not have those costly injuries on the books, where large companies, you can almost guarantee that you can go in and look at their OSHA 300 log and find a number of cases that could have been helped by using exoskeletons. Oftentimes there's a better connection between employees and the safety or the leadership that would be deploying exoskeletons. So oftentimes those employees have had more voice in the process, but that's not always the case. But oftentimes they've been complaining about their back hurting. They've tried back brace. Don't get me started on those, but they've kind of gone through some things trying to solve the problems for themselves. They probably don't have an ergonomist on staff, so they probably don't have that level of sophistication to really understand what's truly going on, what are the ways, but they are aware enough to maybe have listened to a podcast of the Exoskeleton Wearable Robotics Association, or they saw an article in one of the trades magazines about exoskeletons, and they were curious enough to kind of get started with it. And that opportunity to experience exoskeletons for small and medium-sized businesses looks pretty different. Where if you're a big warehousing company or logistics company, I can almost guarantee you've had some exoskeleton companies reaching out to you, really working to try to get their foot in the door into your business. If you're a small and medium-sized business, I can almost guarantee you've never had that happen to you. You have to go out and try to seek exoskeletons, and it's not something you can just go to your safety distributor and put your hands on it and feel it and see what it looks like. It's a kind of a mystical device that's hard to see in real life. And that was something that was great about having a fleet of exoskeletons I could take around to small and medium-sized businesses, of giving them the chance to look, to feel, to put it on, to see how it works without having to make a costly investment to be able to experience that exoskeleton, to make them make that informed decision. Is this something we move forward with or not? I go to a lot of local safety conferences here in the Pacific Northwest, and very rarely are exoskeleton vendors a part of those conferences if they're a smaller one. And that's where most of the small and medium sized businesses are going. They're not going to these large safety conferences because they may not have the travel budget or the staff time to be able to be away from the office that long. So that exposure to exoskeletons looks so much different for those companies. And that knowledge and access is really that first step of being able to effectively use exoskeletons. So the more that we can do to make information accessible and available to companies of all sizes is really helpful.
Yeah, it was the interesting point that was coming to my head was how do we reach those farmers? How do we reach those small refrigeration companies? How do we reach? I've seen a lot of work in Germany about welding. So like you have your own welding business, and you're welding with your arms above your head all the time. So it's those, I'm going to call it 50-person or smaller companies. How do we reach those people, do you
I think
think?
you have to go where they are, and that's the critical thing, right? Is a lot of these smaller organizations, they're not a part of big trade organizations. They're not a part of kind of like these big companies. You have these cliques. Most small companies don't have time for that or the budget to be a part of those organizations. So it's figuring out where are they getting their gas if they're a welding company? Who's their welding distributors? Where are they going for their other equipment? And then how do you integrate an exoskeleton? Is this is just part of the equipment for this industry. I know like there's these little small farmer potlucks that happen in my community, and most of the people that attend are vegetable farmers. And what a great use case for a back exoskeleton when you are literally bent over farming the ground all day long. And a lot of times these small companies, the owners are actually doing the work themselves too, which is a helpful thing for them to kind of understand when it comes to investing money. They understand why it's worth it because their back also hurts because they've been doing that task for a long time. But I think that's where it's really critical is finding where these organizations are and making it really easy and have it be kind of this no nonsense solution, having the marketing be applicable to that industry, living out what are the tasks that really help it, having case studies be from these normal sized companies, not these giant companies. And just having that real world testimonials of people that are very similar to them, being able to talk about it and use it. A lot of times, the things that we see published about exoskeletons, the average person can't really understand. You start talking about a lot of these really scientific terms, really fancy things that ergonomists and engineers absolutely love. But to the average welder or farmer, they don't care about any of those things. They want to know it makes me feel better, it helps me do my job better, and I'm not sore or injured at the end of the day. That's what they really care about. And that's where I think a lot of the marketing is really focused towards the safety community and really trying to show that piece of it and not as much about that user acceptance, that user satisfaction part of it, which is absolutely critical in these smaller size companies.
And also what I heard you say, which I liked, was I bring a basket of exoskeletons and they try them on. So I'm just thinking out loud, like when I was working in a manufacturing plant, you had to buy steel-toed shoes. But the company that I was working for, it was Gore-Tex. The company I was working for, they didn't tell you had to buy this shoe. They just gave you I don't know what it was at the time, $100 budget, and you bought a shoe, and then basically you went and you went to this, I don't know, like, I think it was like a truck would come and you would try on different shoes and you'd figure out which ones you liked, and then you bought the one you liked type of thing. So I don't, I like the idea that you said where you were going around with, because some exos are going to fit some people better than others, right?
Absolutely. And just that personal preference of some people really like a soft exoskeleton, where other people may like a more rigid exoskeleton. And it's more than just being able to try it on. It was really being able to do the work that they would be doing in it for a couple of hours to really get that true experience versus just walking a trade show floor and trying to simulate a couple activities, but to really understand how does this work in my real environment, wearing the things that I normally would wear to do this job, doing the job that I would typically be doing. And that helped the companies really make that decision. Is this worth investing enough to actually do a true pilot? So we would call those just like quick demo days of being able to not provide a full in-depth training. Oftentimes I'm giving employees, a 2 to 3 minute training on exoskeletons. So a very crash course in it, just enough for them to really feel safe and comfortable using the device, but really focusing on just giving them that experience. And then if it's something we move forward with, that's when we kind of go back and do all of the foundations in a half-day training.
I have a hypothetical question for you. It seems that for small and medium businesses, they take what I would call risk, that they will invest in occupational exoskeletons. They will invest in the application of the exoskeleton, which could be hiring a consultant like Evolving Innovation. It would definitely include some documentation change, some process change, possibly some rearrangement of workstations, some training time. So all of that is cost of implementation. And then if it works or it doesn't, the business is the one that eats the cost. So a purely hypothetical question, do you think that medium and small businesses should have some sort of state or government or insurance company subsidy to help them offset that risk?
I think we see this in other areas of technology, that in order for it to really work, that you do have to do something different for these small and medium-sized businesses. In my area, access to internet is a challenge for a lot of rural businesses. And so that's where there's now subsidies to help get high-speed internet to these rural areas, because they understand that these small companies don't have what it takes to get the internet to them, that it requires some additional support. And I think for exoskeletons, it definitely is going to take that. We still don't see that large scale adoption of exoskeletons happening, and the cost is a really big deterrent, and it's also a risk. I think with the quick iteration of exoskeletons, you're a small company and you miraculously pulled together enough funds to be able to purchase some exos. Well, now the new exoskeleton versions came out and it solves all of the pain points of your current exoskeleton. All of your employees are excited about it, but how do you justify buying this brand new device when you just spent all of this money on a device that's now outdated? And those are some of the risks that also happen with this kind of quickly emerging technology. So thinking about how do you support people using exos and continuing to use them as the technology is quickly changing at a pretty steep cost. I think that's where I used to work in workers' comp. And so oftentimes people would ask, do we get a discount if we use exoskeletons? And I think it's going to take some more progressive insurance companies that are going to be able to help their insured really explore exoskeletons, be able to test and use exoskeletons and get started with it. And then if the government kind of provided that grant structure as well, we're starting to see a couple grants available for using exoskeletons. National Safety Council has their MSD Solutions grant that offers a little bit of funding if you're interested in using select exoskeletons. We've seen some smaller companies be able to take advantage of that and try out exoskeletons. So I think the more programs like that are going to be really critical to reaching more small and medium-sized businesses.
Thank you for that.
I have a question. When you talked about prevention, and so I've heard this from a couple people where it's easy to sell aspirin because I'm hurting, and it's hard to sell vitamins because vitamins are used for prevention. You can sell them, you can sell both, but it's easy to sell aspirin, hard to sell vitamins. And you talked a little bit about for the small companies, they're, I'm trying to teach them that this is a preventative device. What do you say to someone that says, well, I don't think I really need it?
It's hard. My background and degree is in public health, so I've spent my entire career working in prevention. And when budgets get tough, the first thing to go is prevention, because you don't see that tangible return on investment. But I think with the more research that we have around all of the other benefits of exoskeletons, aside from injury prevention, we now see some higher quality of work that's happening while using exoskeletons. We've seen good productivity studies. It makes that prevention conversation look a little bit different when there's other factors that we can also include in. When we have a labor shortage and you're having a hard time retaining or recruiting your workforce, being able to offer something like an exoskeleton that helps those really skilled trades that it's hard to come by, it kind of sweetens the pot a little bit as well. And then from that employee engagement piece, we've also heard great feedback from employees that even if they don't like the exoskeleton, the whole process of their company exploring exoskeletons made them think so much more highly of the company that they really felt like their company cared about them and cared for them and their well-being. Even if it was something that just didn't end up working out, just that whole process of going through the steps really meant a lot to those employees. And that's where I think prevention, it comes back to the values of a company. There's some companies that are very proactive when you look at their safety culture, and they really do go out of their ways to try to prevent as many things as possible. But then there's a lot of companies who are really struggling to get by with just compliance and being able to kind of meet people where they're at and being able to kind of understand what is it that matters to this company. Well, it's hard to be able to get the product out the door if your two employees are out because their back hurts. And so being able to kind of also talk about it from a smaller company around the impacts. If you do have a time loss injury, if somebody does have to have a surgery, what does that really look like for your company? Because oftentimes it really hurts a small business when they lose an employee, even if it's only for a couple of weeks.
That's very thoughtful. Thank you.
Occupational exoskeletons don't exist in a vacuum as an emerging ergonomic solution for injury and risk prevention. You're quite experienced with what else is currently bubbling up to the surface and gaining traction, like wearable sensors, drones, cobots. Can you kind of give us an overview of what are these cousin technologies?
Yeah, I mean, there is a whole gamut of safety technology out there, which it makes it really fun to kind of explore, but can also be pretty overwhelming to a business. So there's kind of the identifying and detecting types of safety technologies where we see the computer vision, AI, some wearable sensors that are kind of in that space that help give you the data to really understand what's truly going on. What are those opportunities to really make a difference? And then that's where you may take the information you got from the wearable sensors or the computer vision and decide this is a spot we really need to figure out how to make a cobot work because there's just no safe way to do this job. We really need to get the human out of it and provide a different way of providing the assistance. But that's also where you can be able to kind of deploy multiple solutions at once. Just because you're using exoskeletons doesn't mean you can't use other things as well. And that's where being able to have wearable sensors to help remind employees of their posture and their movement patterns can be really powerful in combination with an exoskeleton. I really like the computer vision and AI-based tools because it allows employees to kind of see that real-time difference in how they're moving and what's kind of the issues with how they're moving. I loved being able to like take a video of my husband trimming goat hooves or picking squash in our garden. And unfortunately, he has really good ergonomics. So it's always me that's the like child that with like the red and the computer vision where it's like you're doing everything wrong. But for me, that's really helpful to be able to kind of show somebody in a non-confrontational way and non-accusatory way of just like, look at how you did this, and then somebody else can do the exact same task and move in a beautiful way without creating any risks to their body. So that's where kind of having that spectrum of options is really helpful. I really like virtual reality and augmented reality for tasks that are pretty dangerous to do otherwise, to be able to give people that safe environment to kind of experience and play in those spaces. Fall protection training is a great example of where VR can really shine. You don't want to learn that you put your fall protection on the wrong way in a real life situation, but if you can do it in VR and then experience that fall virtually, it leaves a lasting impression. And we know that people are going to walk away retaining a lot more information than just if you do an in-person fall protection training. So I think that's where safety programs really need to look at what are their gaps, what are their weaknesses, and where does some of this emerging technology kind of fits into it. But you have to address the people side of things because the best technology is not going to make a difference if your people are engaged. And that's what we see a lot of technology failing is. It may be a great use case for wearables. Employees don't trust their leadership, so they're hesitant to use it. They're fearful of it. And that's where being able to do some of that pre-work is really critical for this emerging tech to work in different areas.
And I take it that is where evolving innovation fits.
Yeah, we definitely help companies have that like 10,000 view of where are your problems? Where do you think your problems are? Where does your data say your problems are? And where do your employees say your problems are? And then be able to kind of prioritize what is a quick fix, what is a quick win? What is something that may be a longer term solution that you can't just wave a magic wand and fix it? And then really coming up with a game plan of what is it that would make a difference, that's feasible, that would work within those situations, and then trying it, getting a lot of feedback quickly, and then determining, do we need to make changes? Do we need to look for a different solution? Or do we need to scale the solution because it's working so well?
Wow, so much. Lots there to keep you busy.
Is there any other, just thinking, is there any other big things we've missed, tasks we missed, anything you wanted to make sure we share with the audience? A lot of really good stuff. I'm just thinking out loud, like, why is it that I've heard that the exoskeletons are being used quite a bit in the small farms in France, but like we tried to get people interested in exoskeletons, in Arizona, because we do a lot of lettuce farming, Arizona / California, and you haven't seen a big pickup, in exoskeletons in the
Yeah.
culture.
I think a lot of that really, you have to look at the industry culture. So a lot of the agriculture is piecemeal pricing. So you're getting paid by the bushel, you're getting paid by the box. And so if you're having to take time off to go don and doff an exoskeleton, go get it, it definitely starts creating some barriers in place. During our field studies, those were some of the biggest things we saw is if you're a part of a production-based crew and you're the only one using an exoskeleton, there's some pretty big barriers in place to you feeling comfortable and empowered to use that exoskeleton. Also, just the overall cost. One of my farmer friends really wanted an exoskeleton. Well, she reached out to exoskeleton manufacturers, seeing if there's a payment plan option, because farmers oftentimes don't have a lot of reserves and oftentimes are working on some pretty small margins. And unfortunately, the exoskeleton she was interested in didn't offer a payment plan process. That was, you need to pay the whole thing in a quick terms, and that just didn't really work for that small farm budget at that time. I think the other big challenge is being able to really find employers that value their employees enough. Oftentimes in the agriculture community, especially when it comes to harvesting, crews that are bouncing around to multiple different employers. And so it's hard for an employer to justify buying an exoskeleton when these employees may only be with them for a few weeks at peak harvest and then go away. And that's where it can get really challenging, because the exoskeleton's cost is so far out of reach for those individual employees to be able to purchase it to take along to the multiple job sites. I think that's where being able to be a part of some of these farm worker organizations, having them be familiar with exoskeletons so that they can kind of help change that narrative would be really powerful. But it is a challenge, definitely trying to get exoskeletons more ingrained in the American agriculture world.
Yeah, I did hear that, where like a group of pickers, I'm going to call them pickers, a group of pickers, they'll go farm to farm to farm. So you as the farm owner, you don't, it's good for them and the farm owner in the sense of you don't have to hire a large workforce, that you only just hire that workforce for the time you need it, I guess is the way to say it.
Where if we could target farm labor contractors, who are oftentimes the businesses that are bringing all of those employees together and that are contracting with all of those individual farms to help provide exoskeletons, then it looks a little bit different, because that farm labor contractor is typically, those employees are with them for the entire season, if not multiple seasons over and over again. But the migratory nature is really challenging. I know even deploying exoskeletons in other industries that still aren't going to the same job site every day, it makes it for a unique set of challenges when you now have your exoskeleton in your car and now your car gets broken into because somebody thought the exoskeleton looked really cool. Who ends up replacing that? Is that something the employer is going to replace? Does the employee have to replace it? What happens when you forget it? You don't have it that day. It makes it really challenging when you're not reporting to the same place every day. And then when you think about the fascinator of a lot of these farms, you're, 80 acres away from where your car with the exoskeleton is. When you realize you're going to be picking water balance and it'd be a great time to put on your exo, it's not always feasible to go back and get it. So figuring out how do you kind of create this as part of the process is really helpful. It can also be really challenging for a lot of these farms.
Where do you see some quick wins then? Would it be roofing? Would it be masonry? People doing block walls? Would it be welding? Would it be agriculture? I mean, where do you think I've said this a couple times, I want to put success stories out there and such that, on either Exoskeleton Report or wearablerobotics.com, and just kind of get some success stories out there, just pushing, they're pushing the industry a bit. Where do you see some quick wins, do you think?
I see it where people are bending and lifting from a ground to waist level on a regular basis. That's a really quick win when you don't have to wear things like tool bags or fall protection, because we know that those can get in the way. So things like people who are tying rebar, because oftentimes you have pretty minimal equipment with you, but you're spending almost your whole day bent over tying rebar together. Great opportunity. Try to get in with some rod busters, just because every time I was working with a concrete company and I would see the rod busters out there, I was like, those are the ones who need these exoskeletons more than anybody, because they are literally spending the entire day bent over tying rebar. I think about welding's a great use case for shoulder exoskeletons, where you have that prolonged overhead work exposure. I think the quick wins come when that really easy, no choice. It's a default for the tasks, where they're doing tasks that would really benefit from an exoskeleton for long durations of time. It's been interesting watching the interaction of some of the shoulder and arm exoskeletons in the surgical world. I think that's where we can talk about that for a multitude of reasons. Of one, the employee has a little bit different financial position, that if they decide that they want to buy it, it's not a huge burden to many surgeons to be able to spend a couple $1,000s on something that makes them feel better. They often set the pace of the room. So if they need to don their exoskeleton, people aren't going to be giving them grief about it. And they also are typically empowered to do what they need to take care of their bodies, because it is such a priority, being able to do their job. So it's been fun watching the traction of exoskeletons in the medical and dental world. I think that's a really interesting area, but there's definitely some barriers that aren't able to translate to other industries as well. I think laborers on a lot of construction sites have a great opportunity, because when it comes to that heavy lifting, regular lifting, oftentimes it's the laborers who are doing that on job sites as well. Manufacturing and logistics is like the easy go-to place, because a lot of exoskeletons were really designed and refined in those environments. So it's kind of the default choice, because that's where the exoskeletons were made. So if you're in a logistics or manufacturing environment, I think those are some of the quick wins. You just have a little bit different things you have to go through to make it work.
Yeah, that was a great list. I once asked my dental hygienist, did she want an exo, and she didn't even know what they were and things. And also there is some chairs out there, right, that help support. And then once that we were, hair, like a barber or hairdressers and things like that, you'd think they would want exos at some point too. But it was interesting, because when I was talking to a dentist, there's a lot of dentists that leave the industry because of shoulder pain. And I didn't realize this either. The nurses that do the sonograms, because you have to hold something heavy, but you have to have really nice fine control or something. I don't know how to say it right, but they have a lot of they'll leave the industry too after a while.
Yeah. And that's where I think just having that information would be out there, that there are these solutions that are available that can help alleviate these issues, and getting people familiar with them before they're in so much pain that they're ready to leave. Because once you have that severe of a condition, it is hard to kind of bring somebody back from that thing. Where if we can get people right out of school, where they're using the exoskeleton as part of their training program, that they would learn from the beginning that this is how they can do it, then they'll never experience those conditions. I live on a dead end road, and I have a neighbor who's a dentist on my road, and he's seen me out in the fields working in an exoskeleton a couple of times. And that's something he's really interested in, is how can we work together to bring that knowledge to the local dental community about it, of looking at how can these solutions really help us. Because once again, at least in my area, a lot of the dental shops are small businesses. It's not owned by a large company. It's these couple dentists maybe together that are owning their shop. And so if they do have to leave, it is a very challenging decision, because they're not just leaving their job. It's really their whole business, their career, their identity. And it can be really, really challenging for those individuals. And America is aging, and a lot of these people in these industries are at that point where their bodies are starting to not work as well as they potentially did. They're at that point where they are starting to say, how many more years can I do this? How much longer can I put up with the pain or the numbness or the challenges from doing those awkward postures for so long? And that's where I think we have a great opportunity of giving people the chance to try out an exoskeleton, see that it can make a difference, and help kind of be that bridge between this mystical exoskeleton world and the real world.
Yeah, I like what Urs Schneider was doing. Part of like Urs Schneider was doing. He's been working with trade schools in Germany where he's putting exoskeletons in a welding trade school such that then they're using them as part of a learning process. So I don't know how to do it in the U.S. per se, but it's certainly needed.
Really. And I think that's where you can look at cross injuries of, whether it's be safe patient handling and healthcare. How different would that look if we were using exoskeletons for safe patient handling compared to, we know that there's not always equipment available. And that's one of the reasons a lot of people leave healthcare is because of back injuries. And if we can prevent that and teach people from the very beginning and that there's ways that we can go about this a little bit differently is really helpful. I think trade schools are absolutely a key link, but then it becomes a challenge of when you're out of school, where do these exoskeletons come from? And that's where I think it starts looking a little bit more desirable if you're a new grad and you see a company that's providing exoskeletons for their employees versus a company that says, we just want you here. We want you to give us your body and then we'll give you a paycheck at the end of the day. And if you're in pain, that's on you. And so I think those are some of the ways that companies can kind of set themselves apart, but we have to create that foundational expectation of people want exoskeletons to be used and that they want to have them available.
And then in terms of education and getting the word out that there's new technologies, or even explaining better how some of the older technologies work, you mentioned that you have your own podcast.
Yeah, I work with Staplepedia and we have Hard Hats and Hearts. It's really focused on human-centered design and the intersection between that and safety technology. And so we have conversations with a wide range of guests that have had some sort of experience using human-centered design to either refine their product or to improve their safety program using those principles. We're on all the normal podcast channels, Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts. But Hard Hats and Heart is the Staplepedia podcast.
How many episodes do you?
Oh gosh, you're putting me on the spot. I want to say we've done 10 episodes now, so a good amount. We've had some great guests over the past year.
How would our guests get a hold of you if they're interested in talking with you about, small, small, medium, and large, but let's say small businesses? How could they get a hold of you just to talk to you about how to implement an exoskeleton?
You are able to book an exoskeleton free 30-minute consultation on our website, innovatepnw.com, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn or email at sarah@innovatepnw.com. Absolutely love to help companies explore exoskeletons and see what the right pathway for them is. We offer really customized solutions to meet people where they're at.
Innovate BMW?
We're just paying the bill so it goes live soon, but by the time this podcast airs, it should be live.
Oh, got it. Okay, I have it saved. I have it bookmarked already. Good. Just checking that I have things on my end.
Is there anything else we missed? You think so, or anything?
I'm trying to think of if there's big buckets. Is there anything you were hoping I would cover, Bobby, that I haven't done so far?
No, this was more than 15 out of 10.
Yeah,
because we touched topics that I didn't even dream of us touching, like where does government go in? What is the nature of farming in the US? How it's totally different from that. You touched on so much. Anyone would be like already overwhelmed by this amount of information, I think.
No, but I also liked how we discussed different industries, and there's a lot of industries there. The wins that make sense. So
thank you all for joining us. Episode 14 of our podcast. Sarah, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and your hands-on real world experience. This was much better than anything I could have anticipated. I loved it.
This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you, everyone.
No problem. Thank you again for having me on your show.
If you'd like to hear more of this content, please support us on Patreon. Over.